In the course of doing financial planning for clients, one of the primary questions that I'm asked is, how much am I going to need in order to retire? Well, it depends. But if you think about, there's really three different groups of people. You have your upper middle class type of retiree that usually has somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million in assets. A upper class retiree has between $2 and $5 million of assets, and what would be considered wealthy have $5 million plus. Now, typically, the more assets that one has, the higher their standard of living typically is. In other words, they tend to spend more as they go up the economic ladder. Now, that's not always the case. There's a lot of people who spend far less than their means, and maybe one of the reasons why they have as much money as they do. In fact, it's probably the primary reason. But a lot of this really depends upon lifestyle. Now, a good rule of thumb would say that you need somewhere between 80 and 90% of your pre-retirement earnings in order to pay your living expenses. But I think one of the things you really need to think about is, what are those living expenses going to look like in retirement? We like to break out our living expenses for clients between fixed expenditures, which are those that basically inflate your food, utilities, real estate taxes, that type of thing. And then discretionary expenditures would be more entertainment, travel, things like that, that frankly, as you get older, people will spend less on discretionary expenditures. So, but there's a lot of other factors that must be considered when you're thinking about how much you need. What's the debt load? How much do you have? How much do you owe to other people in the form of mortgages, car payments, student loans, other kinds of things? Clearly, the more debt, the more you may need in retirement spending. The other consideration is, in terms of your asset level, if you've worked for the government or the Pennsylvania school system, or some companies, they will provide pensions. So therefore, if you're getting a pretty good pension that's paying you 80% of what you were paid when you were working, that would necessarily mean that you'd probably need less in the way of retirement assets for your survival. Social Security, that's a biggie. Social Security would be when you file for Social Security benefits. So as you may know, you get about another 8% a year for every year that you delay Social Security benefits. So the longer that you can delay that benefit, typically the higher the benefit becomes. However, that means you're going to have to draw on other assets in order to pay your retirement living expenses. So again, some considerations. Inflation, don't forget about inflationary pressures. We're in a very high inflationary period now, but inflation is always going to be with us. Hopefully a little less than what we're experiencing now, but inflation needs to be considered. An inheritance. Will you expect an inheritance sometime in the future? That may affect how you handle the need, so to speak, how much you need to set aside to make sure that your retirement is taken care of. Healthcare expenditures and the effects of staying in a nursing home or long-term care kind of living arrangement can be a significant drain that also needs to be factored in as you look down the road. So bottom line is there's a lot of considerations, and you really need to look at this on a very individual, personal basis to figure out the answer as to how much you really need in retirement.